Hey everybody, welcome to the FlightBridgeED Podcast, where we are going to move towards a new way of delivering content in 2022, and that is based on a lot of video podcasts. We're going to be publishing those on YouTube. That's probably where you're watching this now. Or we're still going to publish these on our standard app through iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or your Android-specific favorite app that you currently use. But we wanted to put this out in different methods, and hopefully you will enjoy.
The content of this podcast is based on medical fact and evidence-based practice from credible, authoritative sources, but is not a substitute for your institution's policies, procedures, common sense, or good judgment. The views and opinions are those of Eric Bauer and FlightBridgeED in their entirety. This is the FlightBridgeED Podcast, critical care and emergency medicine education for nurses and paramedics. Here's your host, Eric Bauer.
On scene with a 25-year-old male that was found laying in a snowbank. The core temperature would not register with a tympanic thermometer. All signs lead us to believe that he's been dead for a considerable amount of time.
There's an old adage, you have to be warm to be pronounced. You cannot be cold and dead.
Given his age and the fact that he has induced hypothermia, I don't feel comfortable technically to call him.
Last time he was seen, accounted for, was about 9:30 the night before. So we're looking about 10 hours outside in sub-zero temperatures.
I know where we're going. This is probably going to be a futile effort, but I think we need to do our best for him.
This podcast today is going to be on hypothermia. I recently did a vent course for Marshfield Fire. And when I arrived in Minneapolis, it was obviously very cold. I think it was negative 20. I was quite surprised by how cold that really was. And as I traveled up into Wisconsin, I recognized that it was even colder, and with the wind chill was right around negative 27. So when we think about this, obviously there's a lot of listeners around the world, and you live in some really cold environments, and we have others that live in warm environments. But we're seeing right now, specifically in the South, temperatures that drop significantly, and we can easily see hypothermia in our patients. So this is an amazing case we're going to cover, and it's a case that is involving a 21-year-old male that has been out partying with his buddies. He ends up walking home. He's intoxicated, and he actually passes out. And he passes out into a snowdrift. The next morning, his dad notices he's not home, gets a little worried, calls some friends. They say he'd left before them. And so he starts moving towards the direction of the bar that he was at. He finds his son in a snowdrift. His son was face down, looked like he fell and hit his head. Temperatures that morning were negative 5. And so, we're in negative temperatures all night long, and he was down for at least 12 hours. When Dad found him, he called 911. EMS arrived very, very quickly and identified that the patient had no visible signs of life. His chest wall appeared to be completely frozen. They attempted a tympanic temperature, which did not register. Face was completely purple. Extremities were basically locked in place. So they started resuscitation efforts, started compressions. But they felt like, based on what they saw, the patient really was not going to survive. So they call the medical director. The medical director is given the information, and he just feels like, because the patient is so cold, he didn't feel comfortable pronouncing or allowing the EMS team on scene to cease efforts. And so they were instructed to continue resuscitation and transport the patient.
There's an old adage, you have to be warm to be pronounced. You cannot be cold and dead.
Given his age and the fact that he has induced hypothermia, I don't feel comfortable technically to call him.
As we move into the physiology, and before we do that, guys, hey, if you like what you're seeing, if you want to see more of this, please click that like button, subscribe, so you know when we put out more content. I think that will really help us. And really the mindset of FlightBridgeED is to bridge on everybody's current knowledge, but expand that to a wider perspective. Get each provider out there thinking on a broader scale. That's going to really impact our patients, and it really will bring your stress level down. So I encourage you to subscribe. Let's jump into the physiology. When we think about hypothermia itself, how many truly patients have you had in your career that were truly hypothermic? When we think about ourselves, when we think about our patients, we have to understand that our ability to regulate our temperature is based on that thermal regulation off of our hypothalamus. And we do that in a couple ways. We produce heat through our muscles, through shivering. Our muscles really are a massive heat generation source. And I think that's one area where we see men and women a little different. Men, just standard physiology states, has more lean mass. They're going to have more muscle mass, and they're going to probably be a little bit more warm than a woman. And so that plays into it. And we also have, that conservation, our ability to compensate and vasoconstrict and move warm blood into our core area. But we know that as we become colder, we have CNS depression that starts, we have cardiac effects that start, and we start having that depressive or that parasympathetic-like phenomenon. What kind of cardiac events do we see? Well, obviously, we see our respiratory side kick in. We start obviously being more tachypnic, but our blood pressure starts dropping and our heart rate starts dropping, and we start getting into that whole bradycardia. With our cardiac output decreasing, our MAP decreases. That all increases as our temperature drops. And as you start getting to a core temperature below 30 degrees Celsius, that's where you're going to start seeing those dysrhythmias. You're going to start seeing, VFib or asystole. If we couple this with our central nervous system and we think of this in combination with our cardiovascular system, so our brain and our heart working in tandem, what happens as our core temperature drops? Well, we know we have a decreased metabolism. We know that we end up seeing a decrease in oxygen consumption as our temperature drops. That's actually something that's maybe favorable for patients with long downtimes. And that's where we get the adage of you can't be declared dead until you're warm and dead. As our temperature drops, we get down below 30 degrees Celsius. Obviously, we start having those arrhythmias, as we stated before, but your overall electrical activity in your brain also reduces. And as we continue to drop our temperature, we get down below 20 degrees Celsius. In studies and cases that they've done, they've recognized that usually EEGs on these patients show very little to no electrical activity in the brain, where we could actually say they're brain dead. The thing that I want to really highlight, though, is that truly the case. One of the areas we have to also be aware of is the concept of core temperature after drop. And so as we start looking at how we're going to raise that temperature, understand you're probably going to have another drop in temperature. As you increase the temperature in the body, your extremities will start dilating a little bit, and all that cold blood, all that cold liquid inside the body is going to then flood the core area, and you're going to have that after drop effect. When we think about stage 1, really, that's the mild stage, and we say that that's right around 32 to 35 degrees Celsius, which for us in the United States, that's going to be anywhere from 89 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And you're going to start seeing these patients have vigorous shivering. Remember, shivering is always going to be limited to our patient, meaning that our pediatric patients are patients that are elderly. Do they have the glycogen stores available to really generate heat and generate enough energy to shiver for long periods of time? Couple that with those types of patients where, the smaller the infant is, their ability to generate heat is almost non-existent, right? Their hypothalamus is immature. They have no insulating brown fat. And as we all age and we get older, we start losing weight, we start losing muscle mass, we start losing that fatty layer, and the same thing happens. We can't regulate our temperature. So those two types of patients are going to be very, very susceptible to dropping their temperature very quickly and not being able to compensate like you or I. Our judgment becomes altered. We start seeing an increase in respiratory rate, right? The first stage of shock is always that increase. And we're going to start seeing the tachypneas, the tachycardias become increased. One of the telltale signs that you're cold, and I want you to always remember this, if you're outside working, if you're outside, in a nature environment and you're hunting, you're fishing, whatever you're doing, you start peeing a lot, right? You're not taking in the fluids that really warrant that you're urinating to the extent that you are. That could be a sign that your temperature is actually lower than you think. And that's called cold diuresis, where you start, really dumping that overall fluid. And so really cold diuresis is that increase in renal blood flow from the vasoconstriction that happens. And as our hypothermia continues to ensue, the kidney loses the ability to reabsorb that water and have the ultimate ability to regulate like it normally does. And it ends up having almost a resistance to that vasopressin. Now let's look at the second stage, or what's called the moderate stage. The moderate stage is really 28 to 32 degrees Celsius, and that equates to 82 to 89 degrees Fahrenheit. So think about that. The moderate stage is really that stage where we focus a lot of attention on in teaching, where that 30 degrees Celsius mark is really that area where it's a tipping point. Below that, you're going to really withhold medications. You're going to withhold defibrillation, only one defibrillation attempt until you get that temperature above 30. And so that is really the moderate area. So what happens in this area? Well, we lose the ability to shiver. We become very lethargic. We have an inability to really make any core decisions. You're going to have a poor ability to consume oxygen. And you are going to see these patients start to have arrhythmias, most likely go into that comatose state. VFib, asystole will ensue as you drop below that 30 degrees Celsius. If we move into the last stage, that last stage is the severe stage. That's anything less than 28 degrees Celsius, which is going to be less than 82 degrees Fahrenheit. These patients are comatose, likely in VFib or asystole. They're, completely obtunded. They're probably frozen. If they do have any urine output, it is completely decreased, right? Kidney function is decreased. They're going to be hypotensive, decreased MAP, decreased cardiac output, obviously. And that's going to be even more so, as we all know, with any arrhythmias that are in place. If we go back to the case really highlights a lot of great teaching points. As we looked at before, this patient was completely rigid, chest wall was frozen. Medical direction had advised the paramedics on scene to transport the patient, start resuscitation efforts. They had already started compressions and CPR. They did not get a registered temperature tympanically. So what is something you could do? If you were able to, could you do a rectal temperature? Absolutely. If the patient was that cold, could you even access that area easily? So you want to make sure you're doing what's best for the patient at that point, and that is compressions and ventilations at the best you can at that time. And so this crew continued compressions. CPR was conducted for over 2 hours from the time of their arrival until they got to the facility. And one of the areas I really want to focus on is really, why did this doctor focus so much on this patient? And I'm not knocking anybody out there, right? I think it's all based on your judgment. It's really easy to armchair quarterback. But do we always do everything we can for our patients that are this cold? And I think this case really highlights that really anything is possible. It's always probably best, honestly, to transport these patients, get them to a facility where they can start rewarming, get labs drawn, get that temperature above 30. And really, what is that predictive measure? Well, one of the most important predictive measures for survival in hypothermia is a potassium level. If that potassium level, and this is changing constantly, if that potassium level is greater than 10, I'm reading some research saying greater than 12, the likelihood of survival is almost nothing. But if that K comes back in normal ranges or below that level of 10, then it's very likely this patient has a possible trajectory towards survival. One paper I read, and I'm going to do another podcast on, was the patient ended up having a K greater than 9. And at the time of publishing this podcast and the time of the paper that I'm highlighting, really there was only 1 or 2 patients that had ever survived a hypothermia with a temperature, critically low like that, less than 30, with a K greater than 9. And as I said, now they're saying K is greater than 10 to 12. The point is, if you don't have the ability to recognize that, get them to a facility, let them draw labs, start that rewarming, and think about all the things that we've seen in the last couple years, right? One of the biggest, greatest things that we know for hypothermic patients is ECMO. And so even though maybe a facility in your area doesn't provide ECMO, could you transfer this patient to an ECMO center? As I said, they drew labs on this guy. Labs came back and K was in the 6 range. And so they determined based on that, physician talked to the dad and identified, hey, you know what, this guy has a chance. We're going to do everything we can. We're going to continue rewarming the patient. So that's exactly what they did. Obviously, we have to understand that hypothermia and anything that causes our temperatures to drop really causes electrolyte imbalances. And really that area that is a focus is potassium. And it's because we see cell death happen. And that cell death happens because our cell membranes become damaged. We start having protein dysfunction. You have crystallization. And the intracellular and extracellular water area becomes altered. And so you start having a big change in that potassium's ability to move across from the extracellular to intracellular compartments, and that causes that hyper-K state. So it really predicts cell death is what it does. How bad is that cell death? If we continue looking at this case and we look at their ability to resuscitate, they continued to do compressions. As I said, CPR was done for over 2 hours. They finally were able to do a rectal temperature once they got the patient to the hospital, and that rectal temperature was 18 degrees Celsius, which is 64 degrees Fahrenheit. So think about that. Our normal body temperature is 98.6 in that range. And so that is a massive drop. CPR continued. Patient had a transferring physician accept the patient at an ECMO center, and the patient was flown to that facility for ECMO. Once the patient was at the facility, they were able to recognize that the core temp was up to 30 degrees Celsius. So how did that happen? We went from 18 degrees Celsius at the point of recognizing through that rectal temperature. So it's important for us to highlight the rewarming procedure really outside of ECMO. So let's do that real quick. Really, the first is passive external rewarming. And that is where we start from really the simplest things, moving them out of that cold environment, removing all the wet clothes, moving into a warm ambulance or into a warm environment, wrapping them with blankets, insulating them. And then you move into, does the patient have any ability to shiver? Obviously, he did not. But that's where that passive external rewarming really works, is you're using your own thermal regulation, your own shivering mechanisms to generate heat, but you're insulating that patient. So simple stuff. He was way beyond that point, but all those little things help. As we move into active external rewarming, that's where you start applying the heat packs to the skin or the axilla. Make sure that we don't have any burned areas. Be careful in those situations, but we really want to make sure that we have intact circulation, hot water bottles, things like that, and then obviously forced air rewarming systems that can be put around the patient are huge. If we move into the last phase of rewarming, that is active core rewarming, and that's where we have warmed humidified O2, we have heated IV fluids or warmed IV fluids. We move into lavages in those core cavities, and then obviously ECMO. And ultimately, the goal is resuscitation to continue to improve on that core temperature until we see a core temperature really greater than 30 degrees Celsius. And so if we go back to this case, once they got core temperatures greater than 30 degrees Celsius, he had a change in rhythm. He was asystolic and he went into VFib. They shocked him one time. He converted into an organized normal sinus rhythm after one shock. Pretty amazing. Neuroexam showed very little function. However, when they did the EEG, it showed absolutely normal. So that is an amazing sign. And ultimately, guys, this kid survived. His name is Justin Smith. He is the lowest known body temperature of anyone to survive exposure-related hypothermia.
So Justin's case, from what we can tell, is the lowest recorded body temperature to ever survive exposure from hypothermia.
To go from that day, that Saturday, and seeing him laying in the snow, frozen, dead, and then the next day, there's a chance, his brain is going to be all right. It gives you the chills. It gives you the chills. It was probably March 5th, and he just opened his eyes. He turned his head and looked at me, and I couldn't believe it.
My first memory was waking up at Cedar Crest, and I saw my mom, my dad, and my two sisters. I was pretty much out of it still, but I can remember visually seeing them both. And
Justin just continued to fight the fight every day.
He's just back to normal.
When he's sitting there on the couch with the dog and, we're watching something, it just seems like it never happened. There's other times when I see him struggling to walk here and there, and it brings back, memories.
For whatever reason, any of us were there. Every piece of the puzzle fit in the place where it needed to be.
Really, that morning, not one thing failed. Otherwise, Justin wouldn't be here.
Things just happened in the right way and sequence so that the best possible outcome could occur.
With any miracle, there's always luck and hard work.
A good day, we'll go out, play football, baseball, take the dog out for a walk, we'll hunt together, fish.
He has this personality, and through this whole experience, that's all we wanted.
If you're having a party, he's the life of the party.
I like to make people laugh. I like seeing people happy.
No human being should be able to survive the cold and the temperature of 18 degrees and lack of pulse and pressure for 12 hours. But Justin Smith did.
I'm still here. I got a second chance. I'm pretty happy.
I'm glad you're here, buddy. Me too, man.
The lessons of this case is that we have to understand that our ability to compensate, although significantly decreased in a hypothermic state, the colder somebody is, the more likely, the more possible it is for them to survive. This guy had a 12-hour downtime. So I challenge each one of you. If you live up in the cold areas, I was talking to providers up in Minnesota, Wisconsin about, ice fishing accidents or people out on the ice, falling through the ice. A lot of times it is a body recovery. But what I really challenge you to do is to maybe change your mindset. If you're able to find this person, again, this guy, Justin Smith, 12-hour downtime, lowest core temperature ever recorded on a survival basis. When we look at it from this case, I don't know if there's been somebody lower since then. But I challenge you to resuscitate the patient. I challenge you to get them to a definitive facility where they can check labs, determine if the potassium is exceedingly high. Is it greater than 10, 12? Remember, that is a reflection of cell death and that cell membrane damage, and that whole sodium-potassium pump is now destroyed. You have that intracellular, extracellular water crystallization, and you have a massive electrolyte imbalance. If potassium is normal, I challenge you, put that patient on ECMO, get them to a facility. Ultimately, the physician at the hospital is going to be the ultimate say. But you as a provider, you have relationships. You do have a voice. You can advocate for your patients. And I think it's very, very likely that a lot of patients might survive if we take the time. Again, it all comes back to trying. Some will be successful and some won't. Again, guys, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I hope you enjoyed the video style. Again, we're going to do every podcast moving forward in this manner. And again, subscribe and like, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Medicine education.